Hey guys, this is chess coach Andrew Rankin. Today I want to show a second game in the Caro Kann Fantasy variation. First, to solidify our understanding of how to play the opening, and second, how to play the middle game, because there are quite a few things white can do, a lot of tricks and traps on the sides of the boards, and a very complicated center. So this was a game I played on chess.com against a 22-36 rated opponent, non-titled this time, but I hope you guys enjoy. So the game starts with e4, c6, d4, d5, and now f3, the fantasy variation. And we want to take, and when he takes back, we play the move e5. And again, he can't really take the pawn because we play queen to h4 check. If he blocks with g3, we take the pawn and then we take the rook. And other than that, his choices are to move the king, and that just looks really bad for white. So that's why white continues with knight to f3. We pin with bishop to g4, and now my opponent plays bishop to c4. But I want to go back here and sort of fix something that I didn't elaborate enough on in the last video. So if he takes here, we play knight to d7, attacking the pawn. And if he plays, say, bishop to c4 here, we actually need to insert the move queen to c7, because if we take right away, then he trades queens, and then the knight is going to be hanging on e5. So taking with the rook would probably be better, and then he takes our knight. So this would be not ideal, and that's why we insert the move queen to c7, and now this pawn is definitely going to fall. But your opponents are very unlikely to take on e5 at this point. Instead, they're just going to continue with bishop to c4. And now the threat is bishop takes, king takes, knight takes, check, and then wins back the piece plus 2 pawns. The best move here is knight to d7. The only other move that doesn't blunder the tactic is bishop to h5. I don't like bishop to h5, however, because we want to play principled chess, and we'd rather develop a piece to solve our problems instead of moving a piece that we've already developed twice, especially when we're only on move 6. So my opponent correctly continues with castles. Now we can play knight to f6, and he plays bishop to g5. I think a better move here would be simply c3, which defends the center. That's always something you want to do, but bishop to g5 is fine. Again, we want to develop our bishop to d6 because we're playing the point defense. We want to make sure our point is nice and sharp, and we never allow any tactics or pawn grabbing opportunities for our opponent. And now he plays bishop takes f6. I think a much better move would just be to keep the tension and play the move c3. But yeah, he decided to take, and we can actually take with queen or knight. But I decided to just take with the knight. I'm not worried about this pawn because if he plays a move like pawn takes, again, we can't take back right away because he trades queens and then wins the piece. So we would take the knight first, and then if he takes back with the queen or the rook, it doesn't matter, we can take with the bishop. Or another way that we could go about doing it, if he takes the pawn here, is we can insert the move queen to b6 check, and after he moves the king, then we can take with the bishop. This is probably the best variation, but both are fine. He didn't do that, however. He developed his knight to c3. And remember I said that the pawn really wants to be on c3 and not the knight. So that's why the computer really likes the move knight b to d2, so that you can solidify your center with c3 in the future. So the move knight to c3 here is really going against the whole idea of why white is playing the fantasy variation. White is playing the fantasy variation because he wants to say, no matter what happens, I want to make sure that I have a pawn duo in the center, and I always have a big fat monster center. So here we can just continue with castling, and my opponent plays pawn takes here. And it's very important that we continue with the idea of not taking back immediately because of the queen trade, and so we insert the move queen to b6 check. And this is one of the problems with the fantasy variation, is that he moved his f-pawn, the forget about it pawn, and now his king is vulnerable to some checks. So he's got a lot of weaknesses here. He moves the king, and I took on e5 with the bishop. So now we have some really nice pressure with our queen and our bishop. Our knight is also exerting pressure on this knight, and his center is gone. So he really should have, you don't want to take on e5 because the whole reason you're playing this is to have nice central control. And B, c3 should be a move here. So now his position is clearly quite unstable. And he played the move queen to e1. And the pin is no longer here, and now he's simply threatening to win our bishop. So I decided to trade off the light square bishop, and the computer agrees. The computer already says that black is -2 here, and he took back with the rook. And I took here on b2, so I just got kind of greedy and said, hey, let's start damaging his pawn structure and grabbing pawns, taking advantage of this weak knight. Also, this pawn is very weak, but the computer is a little bit more patient and wants the move just rook a to d8. I'm just grabbing the open file. I think if I was playing over the board, I don't know what I would do. I think I might calculate the line that I played, because I did calculate quite deeply and realized that I think I'm going into a winning endgame. And it's true. But because we go into a rook and pawn endgame, up a pawn, which I'll show you guys here in a minute, I think white actually has sufficient drawing chances, because it's hard to win a rook and pawn endgame when you're only up one pawn. But we'll get to there in a minute. So I played queen to takes b2. He moved his rook to b1, and now I took on c2. The computer wants queen to a3, but I don't think it really makes a big difference, because either way he's going to play rook takes b7. And at least this way I'm going to be winning the e4 pawn. And what I really like about this variation is that after rook takes b7, it actually looks like this pressure on our f7 pawn is going to be really annoying, and it might actually cost us some winning chances. But we have this really nice variation that goes bishop takes knight, and now he really needs to take with the rook to attack the queen. If he takes with the queen, I think we just trade queens, and then we can... No, if he takes the queen, then we just take here with the queen, and then we're threatening... Or actually no, queen takes I think maybe just loses right away to... No, we can take here. Yeah, we always have back rank threats, but we didn't have one here because he could always go back with the rook, would be pretty smart. So I took, and he took with the rook, and now I took the e pawn with the queen. And this is the variation that I calculated, and I thought it was really clever, because after queen takes, knight takes, we're on the rook, so he has to move the rook. And when he moves the rook, I thought a better square would be to f3, which would put all of his pieces on the f7 square. But even if he went to f3, attacking f7, we have this really nice knight to d6 move. And we fork the rook and the bishop, and we defend f7. So we're going to get rid of his nasty bishop, and we're going to trade off into a +2 pawn endgame. So he moves the rook, I take, and he moves the rook. And now I go here, and I like this because I'm threatening the rook, but I'm also threatening back rank checkmate. So he trades, and I trade, and now I'm really happy because we still have the idea of a back rank checkmate. Our rook is now active, and maybe we're going to lose this pawn, but I think we have a nice endgame here that has lots of winning chances. So he moves his king to g1, and I just played the simple move of rook to e6. He continues to move his king towards the center, and it's time for me to do the same thing. Now he starts to move his pawn. I bring my king up. He moves his pawn again, and I want to leave it here, because I don't want to get this pawn too far forward, and I like it here because it's a nice target for me to come win. Now he moves his king forward to f3, and I decide I want to trade this pawn for this pawn and have a nice defended pass pawn. So I go rook to e5, he takes, and I take here. And a little bit of technique here that I want to share with you guys is that when he gives this rook check, I played king to e6, because if he goes rook to c6 check, I was planning on going here. And then if he goes back down here, I was going to go here, and then if he gives a check on c6, I can block with f6. So the idea was to make this triangle move, and then interpose with the move f6. That's not exactly what happened in the game, however. He did give the check, but then he just decided to get behind that a7 pawn, and This position looks quite passive for white, and I have plenty of improving moves. So I just continue with the move g6. That way my king has plenty of squares that he can run around in, so I'm not worried about any checks that like force me to the back rank and then a rook that cuts my king off, because I want to keep my king as active as possible. And he plays h4 and I play h5. Now comes g3, and I just improved a little bit. I don't want the king to come forward at all, and I give myself one more square that I can push the pawn. He doesn't really have anything to do, so my improvement doesn't have to be quick. It can be nice and steady and slow. He plays rook to a8, and I decided to get my king active. He moves the rook to c8, and I give a check. And I really liked the fact that the kings are opposing one another, so when I give any check from the side, his king has to go backwards. So my king controls all the forward squares, and the rook covers the rest, so he has to go backwards. And now I push the a pawn to a5. He gives a check, and I had a choice here. I could go back, or I could go forward. And I realized that if I go forward, I'm actually making a lot of progress here, because this pawn gets really weak. It's super hard to defend. Excuse me. Because when he gives me a check, now I can get into h3, and this pawn is going to fall. He decides to go after my f pawn, but that's really the wrong move. I think here he needs to play rook to c5 so that when I take and he takes, I mean, yeah, I'm going to take this pawn on h4. And if he gives me a check, let's put this on the board. For example, here, 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 here. If he gives me a check trying to win my rook, I can always block here. I mean, it's still completely losing for white, so maybe that doesn't work either. But I thought giving me the passed a pawn as well as two connected passed pawns on the opposite side of the board would be even more difficult to handle. So that's why he gives a check, and then he goes after my f pawn. No problem, I take on g3, he takes, and now I could win his h pawn. So we're up 3 pawns, and we got 1 on the a file and 2 on the g and h files. So this is just a matter of technique. He brings his rook behind the a pawn. I put my rook in front of it, and you notice that I continue to cut his king off. So my king is nice and active, his king not active. We centralize the king. He moves his rook to the c file. I once again use opposing kings to push his king to the back rank. h4, rook check. King goes back. I always want to be able to push a pawn if he's giving me checks. So he goes to c8. I guess he wants to give checks back here in case I push the pawn. But now I can push the g pawn, connect the pawns. He pins the pawn, but I can push the a pawn. King to h1. Yeah, not a whole lot to do. Now I improve the pawn. He moves his rook. We improve the king. Gives a check. And again, I can block with the pawn. And my opponent resigned here. It's a pretty simple win. Let's say that he continues to shuffle his pieces. We're going to push the pawn. Let's say he moves his king here. We can give a check. He moves the king to the corner. We can improve the king. And I think he might have to go to the back rank, or maybe he can come from behind. But then we could go... No, he has to go to the back rank because we're threatening check and then promotion. So after this move, he has to go here. And then we can simply push, push, check. So for example, here, here, check, mate. So yeah, just a nice game with the Caro Kann Fantasy variation. If you know what you're doing, I think you'll find out that your opponent will be out-prepared. You will out-prepare your opponent quite easily in the fantasy variation. I think a lot of them are looking for bishop c4, bishop takes f7 in the opening, and after you play this move, I think a lot of players playing from white are like, uh-oh, I don't get my trick. What do I do now? And if you know the middle game ideas, I think there's a good chance that white's going to go wrong, because it's really hard to play for white here. They kind of are trying to get their cake and eat it too. And too many weaknesses, and again, black playing the Caro Kann is just too solid. So I hope you guys found that useful, and I'll catch you next time. Thanks. Bye.